So first of all, you and I were talking a bit last evening about some of the defining features of this shift that we're going through, which we've been talking about a little bit so far. You know, that which is physical and tangible is becoming intangible, massless zeros and ones. So what do you think is the challenge, first of all, when media becomes intangible?
Well, as you say, the problem that we have is that I can take media, this is physical, it has weight, and if I take the situation nowadays, I can actually take the entirety of all of the written work that I've ever generated in 35 years and carry it on a thumb drive, and yet that book only lasts maybe 3 or 4 months before it fills up. So the first problem that you've got is if you look at how that really impacts. When I was collecting albums, right, back in my teens, there were pivotal moments, like the first day I got 10 albums, the first day I got 25 albums. In fact, by the time you've broken 100 albums, you're starting to show some form of disorder. And thereafter it goes into the thousands. And then fast forward, my kids collectively are running around with hundreds of thousands of tracks. When I used to experience my music, it was a place, there was a physicality, I went to it. You participated generally by going to a physical place for your media. That's all changed. So you have a situation where it's massless, it's volumeless, the actual perceived intrinsic value starts to change because I can't pick it up, I can't touch it, I have more than I can ever consume. And on top of that, you've got all these other things that are taking place on the internet. I mean, essentially, you've got access to millions of people's websites, millions of people's thoughts, millions of opportunities, and unfortunately, most of them appear not to involve the transfer of money. So it's a very poor state. You have a situation where everybody is getting completely the wrong references. You know, the entire role model is entirely wrong. It's yours for the asking. That's what the internet's about. So there has to be a change. I mean, that's a very important change. I think the other thing that is particularly important is that I've now been through a number of digital transitions, different industries. My first one was when I was working in science in the lab, and we went from doing wet chemistry to merely looking at computer monitors using 3D modeling. And then the next time around, there used to be people who stopped red ink bleeding into green ink when you did printing. Guys who used to manage things like blocking and stuff. They didn't exist. You know, Adobe wrote software programs. It started taking place. But interestingly enough, the actual people in the value chain changes, but there's always a value chain. So I think what we're describing, we're in the midst of this big flux that most of the things that we want to do, the actual proper change that we need hasn't quite taken place. So one of the things we were talking about last night, and this is a very important point, the difference between incrementalism and substitution. So you can change things incrementally, you can do them slowly and there's no problem, and generally a lot of people will get with the program because they perceive that's innovative. But sometimes innovation requires complete substitution. And to get people to behave in a substitutional fashion is actually very hard, and it usually requires some form of infrastructure being developed. And in fact, the hypothesis I want to present with you this afternoon is actually the time is now. And I'm not talking about it very specifically from one company. I want to talk about it generically. And that's really the transition in the form factor and the power of the devices that people will consume their digital content on.
Okay, so we've had digital downloads for years. We've had mobile devices for years. Why do you say that right now is this critical point?
Probably the best way is physicality. So this is a small computer. And, you know, to actually interact with it, I have to open it up, I have to get into it. The problem is that in many ways, although it's much more portable than, for instance, a 500-album record collection, it's still relatively inconvenient. The big shift in most personal communications and a lot of personal technology is the shift where devices become miniaturized, they become portable. So the example, actually somebody mentioned it earlier today, where phone calls used to be made to somebody's house, and now they're made to the person, to their pocket. You used to store your albums in your house, now they're in your pocket. You used to store your videos on the shelf, and now they're potentially in your pocket. And then you hear about cloud services. So to get to cloud services, of course, the problem still is mostly you have to go with a computer. And that's a reasonably rich experience, but it's not that portable. This is ever so portable, but it's a very compromised experience. So you can get audio without much trouble in a handheld, but video is starting to be a bit of a challenge. What suddenly happens is tablets. So you're all familiar with iPad. iPad is an interesting beginning because it's not the same as the tablets that are now being released. These things are actually much more powerful than that. This is a twin-core, dual-core processor. It's got like bags of memory. It's faster than a speeding bullet. It's designed to use very minimal software, so the thing rips through, behaves very, very quickly. The key point is that when you start getting devices like this, you have a situation where you've got extreme portability without the compromise. So you have actually both displays and audio. This is 16-channel audio, and it will do 5.1 and 7.1 surround, etc., etc. This is what's happening with the technology. So the physical devices are showing up. But that earlier point I made about substitution needing an infrastructure, the infrastructure is quietly but slowly showing up. And if we talk about the value chain that I was describing before and break it out, if you look at distribution of anything, you've got the creator, somebody in the pipe who had to collect it, distribute it. Most importantly, there was somebody who had to collect the money. And in fact, in all the discussions in the workshops and everything, the key point that we have to keep reminding ourselves is that we can talk about monetization, but somebody has to collect it. And what's getting really interesting is that the infrastructure that's coming up behind all of this is actually the billing systems that can manage the tiny transactions. So if you end up with a situation where you have all of the data that has metafile, so you can actually cross-reference it every which way to Sunday, and you link it to a transactional data, which is the infrastructure that sits behind all of these devices, and you put the whole thing together, then you have both the device that is your portable distribution and settlement and consumption and discovery, and it's not compromised. It's not too small to be useful or a little too big, a little too heavy to carry around. I mean, these things will appear in different form factors, but like I say, please do not underestimate them. These are not like netbooks. Netbooks essentially were cheap and cheerful, almost computers. Most people were very disappointed they didn't do much. These things are so fast and so powerful. So the point I'm trying to make is that this is your distribution point for the future. So instead of the pile of albums in the corner of my room and the subscription to New Music Express and the subscription to Mojo and all those good things, it all fuses it into the one. But the most important thing is the transactional infrastructure exists behind it. So you can distribute your content, it can be discovered, it can be consumed, but the most important thing is you can collect for it.
So we've started to see a little bit about how that might work in how we've seen content being distributed through the iPad. What do you see as being the relationship between content creators and device makers as we go forward, and maybe even like the little players, like the app makers and all that kind of stuff?
It's actually, this is the area that I think is another profound change. So the good news is that Apple has acted as a remarkable stimulus for change. In fact, funnily enough, as I was running through that list of digital change, you'll be surprised how Apple keeps showing up. So they did the printing industry, they sort of helped unwind the publishing industry, they savaged the music industry, and they're presently devolving the video industry. What's interesting, though, in all of those cases, you're talking about a beautifully presented, beautifully engineered, closed, proprietary infrastructure. And the biggest challenge that generally everybody has is that they feel that this new digital example is, unfortunately, a bit of a tyrant. It has dictated the terms and conditions, so the goodness has been somewhat spoiled with the potential downside. I think what changes is a much more collaborative approach, where essentially you end up with analogs to the iTunes Store, etc. But one of the things we were discussing this morning, imagine a situation where you can participate, you actually join the billing collective. You have to register, obviously, because if we don't know who you are, there's no way we can ever settle with you. But the very fact that you have registered as part of the billing collective means that if there is content that gets sold, you will get settled. And it really doesn't matter whether it's per unit pricing or whether it's the proportional settlement by a percentage of a total sale or whatever. But I think that not only will there no longer be quite the same constraint on how you get content into the system, but there'll also be less constraint on sharing. Because, to be honest, again, if we go back to my other point, there is always a value chain. In that value chain, people expect money for the services that they provide. And I believe that the collaborative future continues that value chain. So you know what the percentage revenue share is. And it's all upfront, it's all transparent. One of the things we were discussing in this morning's workshop, my group, was the imperative of transparency and the elimination of ambiguity, because most of what I listen to as being a problem with this industry is usually about lack of transparency and ambiguity.
Can we talk a little bit about the nature of these devices, just sort of from a human-computer interaction point of view, and how that changes the way that you absorb the content and relate to the content, particularly artistic and creative content?
Excellent, because I'd forgotten we were talking about that. This is the other very profound change. If you consider how people interact with technology, the difficulty is that there is always a sequence of adoption. You start off with people who maybe have a little bit more foresight. They see something, they think they might be able to use it to do something with. So they are the integrators. They take a device, they force an application, other people watch them, they think that's pretty cool, then you start getting adoption. But the most important thing is getting rid of the lumpy bits. So, for instance, if to do something involves plugging this in, knowing this, you have to have that code, do this, do that. The other problem is that in my laptop, I still have this challenge of interaction. And one of the things we were discussing last night, for instance, is that people talk a lot about apps. And if you look very carefully, most apps are actually just what we call in the trade Chromeless browsers. What you generally do is you get rid of the bit that you would associate with either an Explorer or a Safari, and you present the content and you get rid of all the bits and pieces. But the most profound thing is that you interact with the machine now by very simple gestural interaction. And in fact, it's getting better and better. So you have a situation where people can actually get the experience they want without having to train. Because the one thing you didn't have to do to listen to your favorite album in the good old days was you didn't have to take a 6-week training, and you didn't have to understand the operating system that was in the amplifier, and you didn't get error messages. So fast forward in the future, essentially when machines like this really work, then the adoption is very fast. That is the reason why you all talk about iPhone and iPad. The actual physical hardware, screen, battery, electronics, yawn. But what they did was the UI. And what that has done is put the cat amongst the pigeons, and it has stimulated such massive development of user interface. There is a company in Sweden called The Astonishing Tribe. Some of you might be familiar with them. If you aren't, Google it later, check them out. These guys actually work with us, and they help design new user interfaces, new metaphors. And I think it's the most exciting time, because you'll be able to get the digital content with much better UI and a much better user experience. And the most important bit is that when you interact with media, there is both the sensual bit, the emotional, the tactile. But the point is you don't always feel inclined to sit forward. Sometimes it's about being entertained. That's the lie back. The wonderful thing about the digital universe is if you want to sit forward and participate, you can bury into the topic. You can find out about the artists. You can understand the other discography. You can discover relationships between other musicians. You can find related projects. If you think about it, the perfect application on a media consumption device is the discovery application that means you're always 2 or 3 hours later going to bed than you planned. You start off, you discover this, you discover that. My thesis is that you're going to see that. We already have, when we introduce, we will be introducing stores that have both the content and the depth and the lyrics. It's not new. Nothing I'm describing is new. All I'm describing is the way that it is realized. And that's the newness.
So let's say, because I do want to open things up to questions, because I'm sure people will have a lot of questions. But let's say we get this great UI, this great user experience, and we get this great ecology between the content and the device, and what did you say? You get rid of the lumpy bits, and you have this much more open system. So it's not as shut down and not so proprietary, which has so much to do with innovation. Mm-hmm. Does that trump free?
Well, you have to admit that 9 out of 10 people do prefer free.
Yeah.
That is the challenge. And, we've often talked about how do you differentiate content, free content, and better content. My suspicion is that in many cases, if the material is available in an easier form, with better curation and some element of discovery, then there is actually an increasing willingness to engage and probably start paying money. The most important thing, though, is don't do what we did before. We said if 12 tracks equals $12, then 1 track equals $1. And then the first thing we found was that the industry diminished by a factor of 12. And in fact, that is something I've seen repeatedly in the digital world. I used to work for a company that made basically equipment that was in every hospital clinical lab in the world. And the devices used to cost $50,000 or $20,000 for a cheap one. And we produced new technology and we could build them for $2,000. And the company sold exactly the same number, generated 1/10 of the volume of sales, and we all got let go. So that's part of the analog dollars turning to digital cents thing that you keep hearing. I think you have to anticipate that. But I honestly believe that presentation, the experience, making the whole thing much more rewarding, providing the depth, will start generating that perceived intrinsic value.
Mm-hmm. So what are the challenges to staying, because this is something that we look at on Spark quite a bit, is how you can, it's not easy to innovate, but you can start by innovating, but then keeping that going as you get a more structured environment. So what are some of the challenges you face, and how have you tried to address them?
So I think the biggest problem with innovation is trying to avoid seeing things as a series of discrete projects. And in fact, that's one of the challenges I think we have as a group here. We have to be very, very careful because you have to think how one thing leads to another. You have to perceive either a cascade or an extension. So the visual metaphor I'd like you to think of is imagine a curve. And all of the points on the curve might be some things that originally might have been discrete projects. But instead, they're iterations and they're improvements and they're better versions of. So what we now need to do, and what we started doing at RIM, is we think, what is the target experience? And then we work back from that. To get that experience, what would be the technology? what would be the other people we need to involve in that process, what is the value chain, back to my earlier point, who's involved. The other thing you have to avoid to ensure innovation, it's so easy to look at something, and if you're used to seeing a pattern, every time you look at it, you see the same old pattern. You go, oh, there you go, just like the old thing. So I'll behave the same way as I used to. The biggest challenge is in the morning you get up, there is a risk to put on the comfortable slippers because then you can shuffle along the path you knew. And innovation requires actually throwing the slippers away and taking another tack.
Yeah.
So important. I've said this actually at transmission before, but I'll say it again. One of the things that troubles me is that you cannot solve all problems simultaneously. So when it comes to music, remember that there is all music that exists from this point backwards, and then there's all music that is about to exist from this point forwards. And I think it's very important to find the solution for all music from this point forward and all media. And then we'll go back and fix the other stuff. Because trying to do the past and the future simultaneously, as we can all see, has been somewhat unproductive up until now.